Welcome to the Refurbishment Mastery podcast with me, Martin Rapley. If you're a property investor who is worried about paying too much for your next property, concerned that you don't know how to manage a refurb, or scared that you will be ripped off by a builder, then this is for you. In this podcast, I share over 30 years of experience of managing refurbishments and conversions to help you make more profit, save your time, and ultimately enjoy the process. On with the podcast. If you're a UK-based property investor, you've probably heard the headline EPC C by 2030. A few months ago, it was everywhere in property investing circles, often raised by people who didn't understand the detail around the proposal, but had probably used AI to create a kind of scare headline to get some engagement. I wanted to let things settle down a little bit before giving you my own take on this, because I think those headlines, as I say, were put together in some respects to get some engagement and perhaps even to scare some property investors into who knows, possibly signing up for some training courses or investing, or maybe even encourage brand new people into property investing circles from the basis that lots of established landlords must be about to sell their portfolio. And you may have read those headlines and listened to other people posting comments and making videos and things, and you might have thought, well, here we go, here's another rule change. You might have been worried about what it's going to do to your own portfolio in the longer term. Well, today I'm going to give you more of a calm, practical view on what's planned, what's still unknown, what could change, and in reality, what I would recommend you do right now. And I'm not going to add any panic in here, and I'm going to try and give you a practical view from a refurbishment perspective rather than from a headline grabbing perspective, which is where I think some of the other people have been. So welcome back to this week's episode of the Refurbishment Mastery podcast, where I try and help investors protect their profit rather than get swallowed up by some of the headlines that go on out there, and all from the perspective of managing our refurbishments and conversions that little bit better. So I'm not going to talk about politics in here, and I'm not going to kind of dwell on the whys and wherefores of the background here. I'm going to try and help you understand the risk and help you make some sensible decisions, but give you the background from a refurbishment perspective so that you can, in reality, make your own decisions and decide what works for you across your portfolio, which may not be the same thing in every single property that you've got. So let's go back and just clarify the core point here, and that is that currently, and currently is a very important word to pick up, currently from 2030, landlords will need to meet an EPC standard of C to be able to legally let out their properties. So at the moment, that grade is an E. So if you buy a property or you have a property with an F or a G grading, you can't let that out. There is a bit of a grey area in there relating to HMOs, but ignore that grey area. If we've got an F or a G, we can't rent our properties out. And the intention, and I'm going to say the word again, currently, is that from 2030, that grading will raise to a C, i.e., we can only rent our properties out if it's A, B, or C. I've got a feeling there's a kind of an A plus grading out there as well, but let's ignore that. A, B, or C will be fine from 2030. And notice what I'm saying here. I am saying currently, and currently the planned direction of travel is that it has to be C by 2030. However, we have seen the goalposts move before. I'm fairly certain there was talk of that goal being in place by 2025. I think it got moved to 2026, and then I think it got moved to 2028 again. So what I'm saying here is actually the goalposts have definitely moved in the past and could, of course, move again. And that's really, really important to recognize because we're talking here about a date that is circa 4 years away, depending on when that comes in 2030, of course, recording this in April 20 sorry, in March 2026. So it could well move again, but roughly we've got 4 years to think about it. But what's really important to realise here, first of all, is that policy is not set in stone. It is a target at this stage. And it shows, historically that governments have been willing to adjust timelines if other things are more significant for them. And this could be relating to the logistics of implementing. It could be down to cost. It could be supply chain. It could be public pressure, practicality that cause them to move it again. And this is kind of where we've got to now. How it's moved a couple of times in the past is external factors. So government talks about these things as kind of, to some extent, as we know, some kind of headline grabbing thing. And of course, it could change in the future. And I'll come back to that several times as I'm presenting this to you today. So the key thing is the target is going to be C, except in 4 years' time, we don't actually know how C will be calculated in the future. And I'm going to give you a little bit more background on that side of thing in this next little part, because the scoring that we're using at the moment is absolutely based on an outdated scoring system that was put together a good number of years ago now to favour gas central heating where gas was available to deliver central heating. And as we know, there are longer term plans to phase out gas as a heating fuel, and therefore we've got to assume that EPCs have got to be reviewed to favour electric or renewable services instead of gas. So on that basis, we talk about needing to achieve C, but now we're saying, well, we don't actually know how we can achieve C because at the moment, we've got today's rules and we know what a C looks like under today's rules, but in the future, C will be calculated differently. Now, if we want some even more cast iron evidence that C will be calculated differently, what you possibly aren't aware of is if you're building a brand new dwelling or you're converting a property to create a brand new residential dwelling, we calculate EPCs from a desktop position because we haven't obviously got a building in position at this stage to calculate the EPC, and we are obliged to know where the EPC will be before we start building. And so that calculation is done using a desktop software modeling system, which is called a SAP assessment, an SAP, Standard Assessment Protocol, SAP stands for. And it's effectively a standard way of calculating what we believe the EPC will be, so that before we start building our properties, we are clear that we are going to meet minimum standards or a target standard for our EPC. And actually, what happened, I was going to say last year, but I think probably the latter part of 2024, is they reassessed the way that calculation was done. So now we're in this odd position where SAP assessments are not in a line with the EPC assessments. And the idea was back in late 2024, running into early 2025, was that the two would be brought in line. And that hasn't as yet happened. But we know that the SAP assessments are more onerous than the EPC assessments, or give a bit more flexibility. I don't want to say perhaps more onerous isn't quite the right phrase, but they give a little bit more flexibility around the scoring, um, and certainly are leaning away from favouring gas central heating. Um, so, on that basis, again, we've got to get to a target of C by 2030. But again, we don't actually know what C in 2030 looks like. We only know what C in 2026 looks like. And somewhere along the line, there's all evidence that that will change. Now, when the government originally said that we couldn't rent out properties with F and G ratings, so when this was and that was bought in. I can't remember when that was bought in. Probably 2018, 2019, somewhere around about that came in. Um, what we do know is at the time that there were also grants and support schemes bought in. So there is a good chance that again in 2030 or whenever this comes in, there will again be some grants and support schemes. So last time round, there was a maximum amount you were obliged to spend on your property, and if that what amount was spent and still you didn't get it to a compliant standard, you could apply for a dispensation or an exemption of some description. That particularly related to buildings that were impractical to get to that standard, and certainly included a lot of listed buildings or very, very old, traditionally constructed buildings where it was just impractical to do it. So it could be that in 2030, similar dispensations come about there. It could be that you are obliged to spend a certain amount of money on your property, but that may not get you to a C, but it could be that it gets you closer, and therefore, again, you get an exemption for your property. But we don't know. We can only say that's what happened in the past. So there's no guarantee it could happen again, but it might happen. And I think realistically, we to get properties from what were the old Fs and Gs, I think that was a really good improvement to housing standards. But actually, there are tens of thousands of properties in the UK at the moment that are at a D or even a high E rating that are really not considered uninhabitable. And and an E particularly, you could swallow up all of that potential budget on improvements and still not actually achieve a C. So I think the policymakers are going to have to be realistic in here and accept that some properties are going to be perfectly habitable. They're just not going to achieve a C. But of course, we don't know, and everything is guessing. And that's kind of what I wanted to get across to you in this episode, is that all of the headlines that went through a few months ago didn't actually look at the practicalities of it. They were just headlines to get eyeballs and people talking, people talking to some of these investors and trainers and what have you, who I don't think really fully understand the nitty gritty of what I'm going through here with you. So be careful jumping into this, because there could be some dispensations. In fact, there were grants available as well. There could be a grants available to some extent to upgrade some of your properties, but we don't know. So we are guessing again. Just jumping in to make sure that you've got everything you need. Now, in a number of these podcasts, you'll have heard me talk about other property investors that I'm currently working with or have worked with in the past. And so I wanted to ensure that you can find out how you can actually work with me. And the best place to start with that is my website, www.refurbishmentmastery.com. On there, you'll find details of training courses that I run. You'll find details about my community and also how you can work with me on a one-to-one basis when you are progressed far enough down the line. And then if you're not really sure what's right for you and how we can work together, then there's a button at the top. Just hit the button at the top that says book a call. It's absolutely free. It will take you to my diary, find a slot, and we'll be able to talk in the next couple of weeks. Remember, the website is refurbishmentmastery.com. I really look forward to helping you with a successful delivery of all of your projects. Now back to the podcast. Now, the other thing to consider here is I've said already that the goalposts have been moved a number of times in the past. And of course, different government, different parties in government could have different views. And I'm fairly certain I've already read or heard in the past that Reform are signalling that they are anti some of the green proposals, and this, of course, is because you'll be aware that in many ways Reform and the Green Party sit on opposite sides of the government spectrum, and who knows to what extent they they are going to agree or disagree on, should we call them, eco kind of green policies. But I'm fairly certain that I've read, excuse me, that Reform are not favouring this kind of legislation as much because they would rather focus on other issues, and that's obviously fine. So not only have we got the current government that have brought in a policy that says it's going to come in at 2030, under the current government, we could have a change of government before 2030, and I'm not going to get into politics here. And of course, any party could override completely that policy or kick it down the road further. And to some extent, that could be based on a vote winning policy or just a realization that it's not practical. Other parties may have different views around the PRS system. So it's not just that, the risk isn't just that the EPC rules could get stricter. It's the fact that there may not even be any rules by 2030. And, particularly if nearer the time, there's a perception that the rental market is being upset by the policy, it could be that any number of parties, including the current government, could overrule or move the goalposts again. And I've also already mentioned that there's a longer term plan to phase out gas central heating in this country. Natural gas, which back in the 70s or so was North Sea gas. We've got enough fuel for years and years and years. That is to some extent starting to run out. It's starting to get disproportionately expensive to recover. Not getting into the technicalities of that. That's well beyond my expertise. But we do need to factor that in. And because in factoring that in, we know that the EPCs at the moment, which to some extent favour gas central heating, have got to be recalculated. Now, when gas central heating is outlawed, which I believe at the moment is mentioned as being at a similar time, so it could all be interwoven into the same kind of legislation or one bit of legislation. But of course, what's going to happen when that comes about? They're not suddenly going to turn off gas one morning. We're not going to wake up one day and find that all of the gas has been turned off overnight. What's more likely, and I'm only guessing here, what's more likely is that new gas boilers will stop being manufactured, or they won't be able to be sold after a certain date. Um, but the likelihood is you'll still get spares for your old gas boilers, and for a while there will be this transition period. But on the basis that, yeah, boilers now can easily last 20 years, and I took a boiler out of a property only a few years ago that was, I would say at that point, over 30 years old. What we can see is that we, this other legislation that is in the background is not necessarily going to outlaw gas central heating straight away. So again, we're guessing. There's no plan. It's not crystal clear, and we're guessing what could happen. And again, a different government or even the current government could move the goalposts somewhere down the line. So I'm also saying, don't rip out your gas boiler tomorrow. Um, be careful about, you know, taking a step at this point that could turn out to be wrong in as little as 3 to 4 years, leave alone the 4 to 5 years under which this legislation might come about. So there is some good news around all of this, though, that perhaps you hadn't fully appreciated. And the good news is that even though, even if they don't change the method of calculating EPCs, there are improvements coming through continually now that to products and methods of construction. For instance, there's a lot more availability of heat pumps. There's a lot more smarter electric controls on our electric heating systems. There's improved insulation products. There's better glazing products, and glazing is one of the places where a lot of heat loss is suffered. And there's now slowly starting to be more competition in the eco market space. If you look at companies, if you seek prices from companies in the eco market in your area, you'll find there's very limited competition. Most of those companies are currently less interested in working in one-off properties. They'll happily talk to you if you're a developer and you're delivering 8 new houses, but if you're delivering at one house, one HMO, 2 flats or so, there's a lot less competition. But we are starting to see more of that competition, and as there's more competition and the products are starting to improve, what we will naturally see is, even on today's EPC calculations, we ought to see some general improvements across across our own current portfolio. And interestingly, anyone who's got an EPC that was done, circa 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, 10 obviously getting towards the end of its life, ought to find that with better awareness of the calculation and potential improvements that you may have just done to your own properties over the time without renewing the EPC at the time, you may well find that even now your EPC score goes up from when it was done 7, 8, 9 years ago to what it is today, because you've improved things generally along the way. So what we can see here is that in some respects, you may well already have benefited, but as time goes on, you could benefit even more. So again, procrastination and not doing something about your property today is not necessarily a bad thing, because in a few years' time, we'll have much more awareness on where the scoring's going, and there'll be better products out there. And generally, our scores could easily go up without actually worrying too much about it. And that ultimately is a good thing. And that ultimately leads me to where I'm going to make some recommendations for you, because I think, that first recommendation is do not panic. Don't run around like a headless chicken, and don't worry too much right this time. We are nearly 4 years away from something that might come in, with woolly targets, woolly goalposts, woolly support packages, uncertainty all the way round. And I'm going to say to you, do not panic at all. However, if you are about to embark on a complete back to brick refurbishment of a property, this year or in the next few months or even years, I would consider working to get that building at least to a high D. If you can get it to C, great, but at least aim for a high D. A high D may well tip into a C by the time the regulations come in, and if they don't, I would think your upgrade costs at that point are going to be fairly negligible. So if you're refurbishing a property today, consider the insulation, consider the heating system, consider things perhaps like photovoltaic cells on the roof, or at least having space perhaps for a battery for those at a later date. So factor in and try and get a good D. And if you can get to a C, that is absolutely brilliant. But if you've got an existing property, maybe tenants are coming and going and you're doing minor works between tenancies, I wouldn't worry about it too much at this stage. If you're doing a full refurbishment, you want to be considering disruptive work. So things like insulating the external walls of a property. If you're rerunning, if you've got to put in a new central heating system, then put in something that's energy efficient today. But be aware that we are guessing as to what that looks like. So do consider anything that is going to be expensive to retrofit, or can't be retrofitted between tenancies or even around tenants, but don't go over the top. If you're buying a property where it needs a light refurbishment, coat of paint, new kitchen, new bathroom, I wouldn't panic about anything as far as EPCs go at this stage. I would get more clarity, do those minor refurbishments, move the tenants in, get the income from the tenants as quickly as you can. 2030 is still a long way away. It's still 4 years away. There are so many things that could change with the rules, the scoring, grants, exemptions, etc., etc. Do not panic is my advice. Keep an eye on policy updates, understand your current EPC position, understand that across your whole portfolio, plan upgrades to coincide with natural refurbishment cycles. If you're going to have a void, maybe do some bigger projects at that point. But do not panic is the key thing here. And don't get over worried by some of the other people in property investing circles who I think are trying to turn this into much more drama than we actually need to worry about at this stage. Now, in 2028, the whole picture may be changing. And I only say 2028 because that's halfway between now and when this might come out. And I may say something different. And I may give different advice. But here we are, March, April 2026. I would be saying, do not panic. Let's see what plays out. And I'll come back to you and, come back with a podcast then with my current thinking at that point. Because we don't really want to be responding to guesses at this stage, and that's all we would really be responding to. So be careful that you don't overspend, don't get too concerned about it. Stay tuned to this podcast, and you're welcome, obviously, to come into my community where we talk about this kind of legislation on a regular basis. And I can obviously, I obviously upgrade my community far quicker and far more frequently than I can do on these podcasts. But otherwise, until the next podcast, look after your profits, save your time, look after and manage your stress. I'm here to help you with all of that. And I'll see you on another podcast very soon.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please do like, share, and leave a comment where you can. If you need any guidance or advice with anything to do with your refurbishments or conversions, then don't hesitate to reach out. You can book a free call with me by clicking on the link at the top of my website, refurbishmentmastery.com. There's other ways you can contact me in the show notes as well. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.